out in the empty desert where the sand stretches for miles, and the wind erases almost everything it touches. A state patrol officer once came across a car sitting alone in the middle of a long dirt service road. The engine was still running, the driver's door was open, and there was no one inside. At first it looked like someone had simply stepped away for a moment. But when the officer followed the footprints leading away from the car, he found something that made him stop walking immediately. Because the tracks just ended in the middle of the sand, as if the person had vanished while taking their next step. And what investigators later discovered about the man who owned that car made the situation much more disturbing than a simple disappearance. Before we start, please subscribe if you haven't already. The man who owned the car was named Daniel Mercer, a 36-year-old survey technician who worked for a small geological company that mapped remote desert land for future solar projects. His job usually required him to drive long distances through quiet, empty areas carrying equipment that measured soil density and underground rock formations. And he had done that kind of work for almost 10 years without any unusual problems. Because Daniel was the type of person who enjoyed quiet landscapes and long solitary drives, where the only sound was the wind and the tires rolling across gravel roads. He lived alone in a small house on the edge of a town about 40 miles from the desert site where he had been assigned that month. And according to the few people who knew him well, Daniel had always been calm and organized, the sort of person who left notes for himself on the kitchen counter and kept his tools perfectly arranged in the back of his truck. Nothing about him suggested someone who would abandon his vehicle and wander into the desert without explanation. The day before his car was discovered had started completely normally. Daniel left his house a little after 7:30 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and several equipment cases in the back of his white pickup truck. His company had asked him to verify some readings near an old dry lake bed roughly 60 miles away, and the route there required following a long service road that cut through open desert where almost no other vehicles traveled. Phone records later showed that around 9:10 in the morning Daniel called a coworker to confirm a set of coordinates. And during that short conversation, he sounded completely ordinary. He mentioned the weather being warmer than expected, joked about the coffee already running out, and said he should reach the survey site within 30 minutes. That was the last normal contact anyone ever had with him. At about 11:40 that morning, a highway patrol officer named Carlos Ramirez was driving along the service road while checking remote utility markers. And as he crested a small rise in the road, he saw Daniel's truck sitting ahead in the sand at a slight angle with the driver's door wide open. The engine was running, and the headlights were still on even though the sun was bright overhead. At first, Ramirez assumed someone had pulled over to check a tire or look at the engine. But as he approached, he noticed something strange right away, because there was no movement anywhere around the vehicle, and the desert was completely silent except for the idling motor. When he stepped closer, he saw Daniel's wallet sitting on the center console, the thermos of coffee resting in the cup holder, and a phone lying on the passenger seat. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no tire marks suggesting another vehicle had been there. Ramirez shut off the engine and called the situation in over his radio, explaining that the vehicle appeared abandoned but still active. While waiting for instructions, he walked around the truck looking for any obvious clues, and that was when he noticed the footprints. They started just outside the open driver's door and moved away from the road into the open sand. The tracks were clearly made by a single person wearing work boots, and they walked in a straight line away from the vehicle, as if Daniel had calmly stepped out and started walking across the desert without hesitation. Ramirez followed the prints slowly, expecting them to curve back toward the road or lead to some kind of structure or equipment site. But after about 30 yards, something happened that immediately made the officer stop moving. The footprints ended. There was no sign of the person turning around, no deeper marks showing that someone had jumped, no disturbance in the sand suggesting a struggle. The tracks simply stopped in the middle of open ground, as if the man walking there had vanished between one step and the next. Ramirez stood there for several seconds looking around the empty desert, because sometimes wind could partially erase tracks or animals could disturb the sand. But the ground around the final footprint was perfectly smooth and untouched. Backup officers arrived within 40 minutes, and the area was searched carefully for any continuation of the trail, but there was absolutely nothing. Investigators expanded the search to several miles in every direction using drones and helicopters, yet no additional footprints were found anywhere beyond that final step. At first, the case was treated like a possible medical emergency, where Daniel might have become disoriented and wandered away before collapsing somewhere far from the truck. But that explanation did not match the evidence at all, because the footprints showed steady, even spacing with no signs of stumbling or confusion. While officers examined the truck more closely, they noticed something odd on Daniel's phone. There were several voice recordings saved from the previous night, all recorded within the same hour between 11:20 and midnight. The recordings were not messages or notes. They were just short clips of quiet background noise, as if Daniel had turned on the recorder and left the phone sitting somewhere. When investigators played them back later, they discovered something that made the situation more unsettling. The first recording mostly contained faint wind and the distant sound of insects outside Daniel's house, but halfway through the clip, there was another sound that did not match the environment. It sounded like slow footsteps moving across dry ground. The strange part was that Daniel's phone location placed him inside his house at the time, and there was no indication that anyone else had been there. The second recording was even stranger. It started with the sound of Daniel speaking quietly to himself, although investigators could only make out part of the sentence where he said something that sounded like, "There, it is again." Then there was silence for a few seconds before the footsteps returned, this time closer and heavier, followed by what sounded like sand shifting across a hard surface. The third recording lasted nearly 2 minutes and was the most disturbing one. At the beginning, Daniel whispered something very clearly. He said, "It stops when I look at it." After that sentence, there were several long pauses where nothing happened, and then the footsteps began again, slow and deliberate, moving closer until they suddenly stopped. Right at the end of the recording, Daniel spoke one last time, his voice noticeably more tense than before, and he said something investigators could not ignore. He said, "It leaves tracks." When detectives searched Daniel's house later that evening, they found the phone charger sitting on the bedside table and the bedroom window slightly open. But there were no footprints outside the house, and nothing inside suggested anyone had entered. However, they did find one thing that made the recordings harder to dismiss. Next to Daniel's bed was a notebook he used for field work, and on the last page, he had written several sentences that looked rushed and uneven, as if they had been scribbled down late at night. The writing described waking up repeatedly because of the sound of someone walking in the yard outside the house. Daniel had written that every time he looked through the window, the yard was empty, but the next time he lay down, he could hear the footsteps again, moving slowly across the dirt. The final line in the notebook said something investigators later repeated many times during interviews. It said, "Tracks appear when it moves, but there is nothing making them." Search teams continued looking for Daniel in the desert for nearly a week, but no trace of him was ever found beyond the truck and those footprints that ended abruptly in the sand. Eventually, the official case report concluded that Daniel Mercer had most likely wandered into the desert due to unknown circumstances and died somewhere beyond the search area. which allowed the investigation to close even though no physical evidence supported that explanation. But one detail remained difficult to ignore. The photographs taken at the scene showed Daniel's final footprint clearly pressed into the sand, and investigators who studied those images later noticed something unusual about the ground just ahead of it. There was a faint disturbance in the sand that did not match a human step, almost like the surface had been compressed by something that left no defined shape. It appeared only once, directly in front of the last footprint, and then the sand beyond it remained completely smooth for miles. The officer who first followed the trail admitted later that when he reached the end of the footprints, he had the strange feeling that something had been standing there facing Daniel, something that did not leave tracks of its own. And whatever Daniel had been hearing outside his house the night before had apparently followed him into the desert the next morning, because the very last place his footprint stopped was exactly where the empty ground showed the faint mark of something else waiting for him.